Good day and welcome to another episode in the continuing series of Managing Your Perimeter. My name's Mel Lukens. We have a special guest host today, Mike Reddy, who is someone that our crew has worked with, some of us longer than others, but definitely a resource for us in the past, sometimes a boss. We value the relationship that we have with Mike, and I'm going to let him talk about himself in just a second. First thing I want to do is kick it off with the shameless plug for the Arcus Group. Primarily, we are a perimeter security provider and experts in the field, having been involved in large-scale national special security events for almost 12 years, which parenthetically is kind of where Mike and I harken back to. And also experts in event production and planning. You can check us out on our website at www.arcusgrp.com. We'd love to get your feedback on our series, what works, what doesn't work. If you think we're stupid, be nice about it, and we can adapt and improvise and come up with better ways to deliver information that's important to our listeners. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike for a minute, let him talk about himself, and I'll be interested to see where he goes with this. Mike?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Reddy, and as Mel stated, I've been a partner as well as a, boss to the folks in Arcus Group for a number of years. I come from over 30 years of both local and federal law enforcement experience. Most recently, I was the unit chief of the Special Events Division at the U.S. Secret Service, where we were responsible for planning and implementing security plans across the government spectrum for national special security events. That is where I came to know our guest today. We can't believe it, but 10 years ago, kind of in this month, we started our planning for the NATO summit in 2012, which was in the city of Chicago, while our guest was the Superintendent of Police there. I'm now in the private sector. I am the director of production and event security for a Fortune 500 company based in Los Angeles, and spend a great deal of time still building perimeters and establishing security plans. I've been fortunate enough to be the first guest on this particular podcast to talk about perimeters and talk about the difference between, a law enforcement function, security function, and what we do in the private sector. So it's kind of interesting to be back here now trying to be a host.
You'll fall right into it with no problem. Mike, since you know Garry, why don't you take the lead? You've already kind of teed him up a little bit, and then we'll let Garry brag about himself for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to introduce Garry McCarthy, who, as I came to know, was the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department during the planning of the 2012 NATO summit. I think that that was probably one of my favorite events and probably the best planned event that I had the fortune of working while I was in the Secret Service. And a great deal of that comes back to the men and women of the Chicago Police Department and the work they did in our topic today in crowd control. I think we did a good job because I do a lot of work in Chicago now, and there are still some people that remember me when I go there, and they're willing to take my phone calls. So, sir, I'd like to go ahead and hand it off to you and hear a little bit about you.
Hey, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. So, Mike mentioned the NATO summit in 2012. I harken back to everything I basically learned while I was in the NYPD. Spent 25 years there. Went on the job in 1981. Started as a patrol officer in the Bronx in one of the toughest precincts in the city. Worked my way up through sergeant, lieutenant, and captain. And I kind of thought that was the end of my police career because that was the end of the civil service tests, and I literally did not have anybody with any sort of political connections. I got very fortunate that Bill Bratton came to town at the time and kind of changed what I called the old guy network in the NYPD to a meritocracy where out-of-the-box thinking was encouraged, taking risks was encouraged, and the plan was put the people in the right seats, give them the authority and the accountability, and go forward like that. And lo and behold, the next thing you know, a few years later, I ran New York City's crime strategy for 7 years. From Y2K. My last night on patrol was Y2K in the precinct I had out in Brooklyn. And the next 7 years, I was Deputy Commissioner of Operations and ran crime strategy for New York. From there, I went to Newark, New Jersey. I worked for a fellow named Cory Booker, who is now a senator.
We've heard that name before.
Well, there's a couple other names. You know, in New York, I actually worked for a guy named Rudy Giuliani and a guy named Mike Bloomberg during my tenure as Deputy Commissioner. From New Jersey, I came out here to Chicago, and I was a superintendent, and I worked for a fellow named Rahm Emanuel for 5 years. So it's kind of like the montage of mayors that everybody knows in the country. But as far as crowd control goes, I really have to hearken all the way back to the way it used to be in New York City. And my first experience with crowd control was Times Square, New Year's Eve, when I was a young sergeant, which was going to be from 86 to 89, where we really didn't have any control of what the heck was going on. It was just a matter of trying to prevent people from getting too far out of hand and so on and so forth. Years later, we had come up with a plan where we would actually control the access and egress to Times Square, and that's when I first started learning about crowd control. You know, moving forward in my career, besides the NATO summit, there were Democratic National Conventions and Republican National Conventions in New York City, and they were all handled a little bit differently as time moved forward, which put us in that position that Mike talked about with the NATO summit in 2012, which, you know, I'm a little bit prejudiced, but I think it was kind of like the gold standard as to how to control mass amounts of people when you know that in that crowd there's agitators and people who are looking to cause problems. During the 7-day summit in 2012, there was literally one broken window in downtown Chicago, and we're not even sure it had anything to do with the NATO summit.
You know, Gary, it's funny you bring that up, because I was there, and actually Mike was my boss for that particular event. And there were just a couple of pockets of people that were, you know, a little disruptive. But the interesting thing, and this is not a political comment, but the interesting thing is all you ever saw on the news was that one, you know, basically 200 person group in one intersection, and it was the sky was falling.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the things that we really figured out quite simply is confrontation begets confrontation. People came to Chicago looking for confrontation, and we didn't give it to them. The initial planning, when I first got the first meetings that we had regarding what we were going to do, had CPD coming out in what we call riot gear, not what the press calls riot gear, which is helmets, but the turtle suits and shin guards and elbow pads and so on and so forth. And I was like, why would we come out like that from the beginning? What we do is we kind of staged those individuals who were highly trained, and we came out with the soft checkerboard hat that we always wear. And lo and behold, it was a very peaceful event. And when those agitators got out of hand, we called in the guys and women with the turtle gear, as we call it, and we extracted those individuals from the crowd with a technique that had it happen in about 30 seconds. Nobody realized how quickly we could do it. We would go, the line would open, they'd go in, they'd grab this individual, handcuff him, take him out, and the protests would go on. And, you know, First Amendment rights, I said it over and over again, leading up to the summit, that I was going to protect people's First Amendment right to free speech, whether I agreed with them or not making a political statement, right? But by the same token, we were going to be intolerant of criminal behavior. And we planned for it, we trained for it, and we equipped for it. And the other thing that's really important is we supervised it. You know, people give me great kudos for being on the front line of that event. But at the end of the day, if I'm going to be calling the shots, where should I be to actually do that? It's really, I don't know, it just seems like odd thinking to me that people would expect the person who's in charge not to be on the scene.
Sometimes some of the most common sense things to do are the ones that are the most elusive. Gary, thanks for that. I mean, that is a, by all standards, very impressive career. And a little bit as a subplot to kind of what we're talking about is we're in, well, we've certainly been in interesting times over the course of the last 18 months, but we're now starting to see that tide shift a little bit, where some of the restrictions that have caused us, great frustration, angst, increased nervousness, anxiety, we're starting to see that change. With what you're doing now as a consultant, are you starting to see a turn in how people are approaching large gatherings?
Well, what I'm seeing more than anything else is that fortunately business is starting to perk up because, when hotels shut down, they don't need security. When restaurants shut down, they don't need security. So as far as my business is concerned, that's obviously a positive. But as far as large crowds go, it strikes me that we don't really learn our lessons very well, and I'm still troubled by the riots that some people called demonstrations that occurred here in Chicago, because we have a written plan. We did an after-action report where we critiqued everything that we did during that NATO summit, and it's on the shelf down there in 35th Street in police headquarters, but nobody took it off the shelf. And the next thing you know, you've got officers running helter-skelter all over the place with no plan, no direction, and then we wonder why it went awry. So it's really troubling to me that people aren't really understanding what's going on. Right after the NATO summit, I remember that there was somewhere out in California. It wasn't Fresno, but there was some sort of disorder. And one of the things that struck me is the first things that the police did was they fired tear gas into crowds. And I had to laugh when, during one of my community meetings leading up to the NATO summit, somebody asked me if we were going to use tear gas to control a crowd. And my response was, only if you could explain to me how tear gas controls a crowd. What tear gas does is it takes a crowd of 100 and it splits it into 10 crowds of 10 going in 10 different directions.
It's also like swapping at the hornet's nest. All you're going to do is piss them off.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually changed our use of force continuum going into the NATO summit, where only I could authorize the use of tear gas. And to this day, it still stands, although there's rumors, I don't know it for fact, that that has actually kicked up a notch to City Hall now makes the decisions on things like that. But again, that's only a rumor. I can't confirm or deny.
Well, therein lies part of the problem too, where you got the politicians making tactical and strategic decisions that should be left to the guys that theoretically are on the street, on the scene.
Yeah, and they're also legislating it and making it part of law.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to just bring home, you brought up the New York Times Square, and I had the pleasure of being a guest at that thing. And I mean, you got to talk about a level of crowd management organization. And I use the term management purposefully because it was management that effected control, and it was beautifully executed. And, the ball drops at, midnight, and kid you not, by 5 o'clock in the morning, all that stuff is gone. And the streets are clean. It is an amazing process to watch. And all of my career of doing this, a lot of it with Mike, New York City is the only city that I've ever run into, and maybe this is true of Chicago too, that has their own bike rack unit with the trucks, and kind of looks like the guys from the training academy are helping sling the bike rack, but that was a first.
Yeah, well, the other thing that we have along with that was something called a disorder control unit that was established in the NYPD probably sometime around 1995-ish. And, we didn't establish a 2,000-person unit. We established a 6-person nucleus that developed a training program, and then every police officer in the city was trained in disorder control, and some were trained up to another tactical level. Like I mentioned, those mobile, they're called different things in different places, but the mobile response units. And if you think back to the Ferguson riots, the first thing that I was astounded by was that we had SWAT officers put on the front line where it should have been disorder control officers. I mean, SWAT has a very particular expertise, and it has nothing to do with crowd control. But, departments across the country really don't get the concept. And at the end of the day, we turned a protest into a riot, which the police can certainly do. But we can also turn a riot into a protest. And I'm really disappointed to see that across the country we're not taking those steps.
Mike, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, one of the things that you pointed out is how things have evolved, and going from Times Square to NATO in 2012, and how the tactics and decision making has evolved. And what do you see as kind of the key to that success in those, and particularly in the metropolitan cities where you're dealing with large crowds, but you're also dealing with large numbers of officers who are available to address that. And what did you see has progressed and what has changed and has made that successful?
Well, I think, Mike, I'm going to kind of thumb this down. It's really simple, and I mentioned it already, that we created a plan, we trained our officers and our supervisors for the plan, and we equipped for the plan. And, probably the worst disaster hopefully this country is ever going to see is the World Trade Center attacks, where I was Deputy Commissioner of Operations. And we actually lost our communications, which I can't stress how important communication is during large-scale events and critical incidents. We actually lost our communications when the North Tower came down. But we called it Citywide Mobilization, which meant that police officers from all over the city were directed to come to Lower Manhattan to the World Trade Center event. And there were various mobilization points where officers from Brooklyn North were directed to go to this location, officers from the Bronx were directed to go to this location. They would show up, they would get put on a roster. In other words, you're checking in, and then you're giving a post and a direction. And I got to tell you something. In retrospect, the execution of that plan in the middle of this mayhem, where, we had actually trained for the fact that in large-scale events, we might have to go to individual command posts in the boroughs. In other words, unfortunately, I didn't like this plan because it had the fact that the executive core of the department got wiped out, and the chiefs in the various boroughs would pick up the pieces and run with it in that sense. But that's the extent that the NYPD went to their training, and to this day, they have maintained that. I'm not sure departments across the country have done it to that level, and I hate to tell you this, but people always like to say, well, the NYPD is the biggest department in the country, so it's easy for them to do that. No, it's exactly the opposite. If you're going to train 35,000 officers, it's kind of hard to do. It's very expensive, very time-consuming. But then there are perishable skills that if you don't refresh them on a regular basis, whether it's every 6 months or over the course of a year, you're going to lose them. But, you can't predict when an emergency is going to happen. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you should see it coming, like the George Floyd riots that took place across the country. Everybody should have known what was happening. Yet here in Chicago, on Thursday night, there was disorder, and I don't think CPD really responded to it until like Saturday. So at that point, the cat was out of the bag, and putting the genie back in the bottle was going to be impossible. But the expertise is perishable, and it has to be retrained. But the training and the plan has to be fluid. Nobody could have predicted that people were going to drive planes into buildings and that there was going to be a collapse that was 22 acres wide and 3,000 people were going to be killed. Yet that's what we were faced with. And at the end of the day, our response to it was swift. It was effective. It wasn't going to change what was going on, and then and then we were able to shift into rescue and recovery as we went forward using those plans.
You bring up an interesting point here from a kind of a management standpoint. Is, correct me if I didn't hear this right, but you kind of went from a centralized command structure to a decentralized command structure that really kind of gave the authority to the boots on the ground. I mean the boroughs, and the commanders that were there on the scene.
Yeah, that's exactly right. As a matter of fact, on 9/11, it was the first time that I actually used my Nextel. If you remember those things, the walkie-talkie phones that we had back in the day. And Ground Zero is literally about 4 blocks from police headquarters in the NYPD. And first of all, I got caught in both collapses. But then once we got back trying to figure out where we were going, I went back to the scene with my Nextel and reported back to the police commissioner and the command staff what was going on, because we didn't have enough communications. And in walking around the actual event, I would find that there was a mobilization point for Brooklyn North here and one for the Bronx there, and I was able to give numbers and figures and post assignments, believe it or not, at that level, because we had trained to it. So there were bosses in charge, they were giving intelligent direction, and the officers were given assignments. And you have to prepare for that well in advance, and you have to keep doing it. And that's become part of the culture.
One of the things that you pointed out was, having plan in place and why those plans were not followed. And I would go back to my own experience in 1997 when I was a sergeant in the Boulder Police Department in Colorado. We had, again, riots around the University of Colorado and really no plan to get started with those. And we lacked equipment and training. So we spent the next several months preparing for the fall, training our officers, equipping our officers, and getting ready for that. The fall came and went fairly quietly, but in the February 1998, the Denver Broncos won the Super Bowl. We found ourselves faced with more rioting. And I remember arriving at the command post after being called out that evening and finding no one in the command post and no one following our plans that we had laid out literally 6 months prior. And I don't know what it is, Gary, about administrations and why they don't think they can follow the plan that was already in place. They felt they had to reinvent the wheel. And again, we spent an entire night, taking back the street when, putting our plan in place would have probably quelled this, very shortly. And the other point I really like that you made is how you did NATO and not coming out in turtle suits and looking like you're ready for battle. You can always get to that, but it's pretty hard to back down from that posture once you're in it.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I got to tell you something. They looked at me like I had 3 heads when I said that. And when we did our after action report and the critique, it was hailed as probably the most important step that we took. And I got to tell you, I saw fear in some officers, which is understandable. You have thousands of people on the street, and you don't know which way it's going to go. And it was all hands on deck, and not everybody is ready for that. And it worked out well for us because, like I said, the leadership was there. And not just talking about me. There were just so many folks who are generally all retired now, like Nick Rohde and Wayne Gulliford, who literally were out there the entire time. Just a whole bunch of high-ranking individuals who were just taking charge and making sure that the plan was executed. And they really did an outstanding job. Steve Georges helped do most of the planning for that event. That was an event that was coming, and we knew it was coming, so we had time to plan for it. Although it wasn't like we did in New York. I think we had about 10 months to plan for it. Where in New York, when we knew the Democratic National Convention was coming, we started planning 2 years in advance. But disaster control Like I said, we had a disaster control unit, and we started training for disasters and large-scale events in the mid-'90s. And I don't think anybody is still doing it today except for the NYPD.
It really takes me back to our time in Chicago and some of the interesting dynamics of that whole adventure, which also kind of brings me in. I want to specifically address and get your input on this. We've talked about crowd control. We've not really talked about perimeter security, but obviously those two go hand in hand. Are there elements to those two particular subjects you see as unique to protecting people both on the inside of a perimeter and also on the outside of a perimeter?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still going to be the same bottom line issues. It's going to be, you have to have a plan, you have to have supervision, and you have to make sure that you execute the plan. But if they're not trained for it, it doesn't work. It makes me tell one of my favorite stories. Around day 3 or 4 after 9/11, Mayor Giuliani made a determination, and it was a good one because he did it along with us actually, to ask for the National Guard to come down to help us do perimeter security for Lower Manhattan. Basically, everything below Canal Street was shut down, and the actual World Trade Center site was also obviously shut down. We didn't want tourists coming in and people coming in to look for artifacts or criminals to commit crime. And the funny story that I have has it that, this is day 3 or 4, and I'm not sure if I had more than maybe 2 hours sleep over those 3 or 4 days in my office. And we make the decision to bring a National Guard in, and I'm part of the team that puts together the actual post listing where we're going to put people and what we want them to do. And the next morning at 6 a.m., I go down to the World Trade Center site like I did every other day, and sometimes I dug and sometimes I directed and so on and so forth. And National Guardsmen stopped me from going into the site. I was a little tired at the time and maybe a little afraid, but I said to him, do me a favor, and I don't think I called him son, but I said, do me a favor, just get your boss for me. And this young captain came over, and he was like, I'm sorry, sir, but you can't come into the site. It's only emergency personnel. And I had to explain to him in explicit terms that the only reason why he was standing there was because I determined that he should stand there. And like I said, I know I was a little bit tired, and my nerves were a little bit frayed at that point. But, all they heard was nobody comes in unless they're, FEMA or in a police uniform or so on and so forth, because as a deputy commissioner, I was in civilian clothes, and it didn't matter if I tried to explain to them what a deputy commissioner was. So, again, the communication of what the actual plan is, what the goal is, really has to happen. And interagency cooperation, as we all know, can sometimes be difficult. But in extreme situations like that, it can get very, very clouded and very muddled. Perimeter security, like I said, for just that event was there for a number of different reasons. First of all, we wanted to keep access for emergency vehicles getting in and out every single day. We were still in rescue mode at that point. And, we were hoping that we were going to find some folks trapped, and up to like a week later almost, hoping that there were pockets that we could recover folks. So first of all, we wanted to do that. But also with it, you have to realize that the population, people who lived down there had fled. They had to go to other people's houses and things like that. And we didn't want the houses to become burglarized and become crime victims. And then the other thing is tourists and scavengers coming down to just, maybe not want to do bad things, but end up doing bad things by interfering with what we were doing. So the perimeter control was almost as important as the emergency response. And perimeter control and crowd control is really critical in large-scale events like, for instance, Lollapalooza here in Chicago. Perimeter control is really important so that place does not get overcrowded, which causes a dangerous condition. And it's also important for the safety of the individuals who are going to be in there. And just a couple of years ago, the guy who shot all those individuals out in Las Vegas had apparently scouted out Lollapalooza, and it made us reflect on, those tall buildings overlooking Grant Park. And, the CPD has to secure those buildings during a large-scale event like that based upon terrorism.
That's a really good point as to, things that I think when you discuss your perimeter, things we did not used to think about, except if maybe it was a presidential visit is the high ground, and what do you do with that? And does that really extend your perimeter out to that since the shooting in Las Vegas? And that really has changed the certainly and now in the private sector, that my approach and what I ask of our law enforcement partners at large events that we do is to control that high ground. One of the things that comes up when you're talking about whether it's a NATO summit or a Republican Democratic convention that is a little bit different is the First Amendment, and obviously the requirement it's to uphold the Constitution and the position of policing to make sure that the Constitution is followed and that those people get their opportunity to express their political beliefs. And I know that Deb Kirby and I spent hours with the ACLU and the U.S. Attorney's Office trying to make sure that our perimeter in Chicago was in a position in which those people attending the summit could hear what protests or what was going on outside. How do you see that as playing into controlling your crowd or working your perimeter to allow the genuine First Amendment protection, not so much your rioters and your agitators, but your true people who are just trying to get a political message out?
Well, first of all, I can tell you this. I'm glad you brought it up, and it reminded me the power of a superintendent to delegate, because you guys had to meet with the ACLU instead of me. But I think it's critical to understand the difference. Like I said, criminal behavior versus First Amendment rights. My dad was in the battalion that raised the flag on Iwo Jima and Matsurabachi. I have a reverence for the American flag. I was raised like that. I never in a million years would burn an American flag, unless, of course, it was being destroyed, because it's done in the proper fashion. But it's a protected behavior, and we have to be tolerant of people with different ideas. And like I said, I don't have to agree with the individuals who might be protesting, but by the same token, I'm going to protect their right to articulate what it is they're protesting about and protect those rights. And I think that can get very muddled very easily. And, there has to be, again, this is going to have a lot to do with training. When do you cross that line from First Amendment to criminal behavior? And it's a very, very touchy subject. And that's why you'll see the lawyers from the ACLU in the crowd with green hats or red hats or whatever event might be happening. And I actually endorse that, because, we can have those conversations and you have a focal point where you could say, okay, look, this is going too far over here. Let's bring that in. And they will actually help us do it. I've had that experience in a number of different events over the course of years. Really critical to understand those differences and to ensure that the officers are trained to deal with that in the right fashion.
The problem with that whole thing is, and you said it yourself, where is that line that separates peaceful demonstrators from criminals or a criminal act? And the stuff we've seen on TV over the course of the last 18 months, whether it was pandemic related or whether it was a result of, an action taken by a police officer, when people start burning stuff and throwing shit, pardon my French, but that's criminal. And it as a civilian, it pains me to see that those actions aren't dealt with swiftly and with a necessary level of force to stop it. And maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole here I shouldn't go down, but I mean, Chief, you've lived it, you've seen it. I mean, you've dealt with it. How do we prevent it?
Well, you extinguish it quickly is the answer. You know, during NATO, one of my favorite stories had it that this guy was in a crowd and he threw a bottle at us. And first of all, he didn't realize that there were undercovers in the crowd. And second of all, we executed that play that I talked about where the line opens up and you have the riot geared officers come through the crowd. I think it was called something like the bow and arrow, you know, because you open a crowd, they go in and then they secure him and come right back out. So this guy throws a bottle and I could still see him. He starts texting like he's telling his friends or something. Yeah, I just threw a bottle at the police. And when he looked up, all of a sudden he saw 12 officers in black outfits with, you know, shoulder pads and everything else coming at him, surround him, handcuff him, and take him out of the crowd. And the whole event probably took 30 seconds. If we allowed that guy to stay in the crowd, it would have emboldened other people to do the same things. So when you can draw the line, breaking a window, spray painting on a wall, you know, throwing bottles or assaulting people, things like that, pepper spraying people, or like happened at the Capitol using bear spray, you know, those are actions that need to be enforced. You have to stomp on the embers before they turn into fires. And you know, it's a touchy subject. You have to be very careful the way it's executed, and it has to be done at the right time and properly.
Yeah,
and you can only do that if you train and supervise.
Yeah, and then to kind of bring that full circle, I think reasonable people can disagree, and they can disagree vehemently, but I'll defend to the hilt their right to express their opinions. You know, and that's kind of the interesting line that we have frequently walked. Well, I want to kind of bring this somewhat to a close. It has been, Garry, it's been a fascinating conversation to hear about your experiences in New York City with 9/11 and Chicago, and the expertise and professionalism that you brought to the folks that you had the opportunity to work with in those cities. And I'm not leaving New Jersey out. I mean, I just, you know, don't want to give anybody short shrift here, but I just, it has been fascinating. We appreciate your time. Look forward to engaging again, you know, as we're kind of moving into another new paradigm. It seems like now we have 2 of those a year almost. So Garry, thanks to you. Mike, appreciate your guest hosting. I'll tell one quick story about Mike. I saved this for the end in case we've lost our listeners anyway. But my first adventure with Mike was in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, where there was some museum or something that we were doing together, planning a presidential trip. And our hosts, the Saudis, wanted then George W. Bush to dance with them holding swords. And all throughout our 10 days of planning, Mike would ask me every day, he said, now you're not planning on the president to get in this line and hold a sword or get even near the guys with a sword. I said, nope, absolutely not. You know, we're just going to walk past these guys and everything will be fine. Well, of course, president pulls up, gets out of the beast, walks right up to the dancers, grabs a sword and starts dancing, starts basically doing a line dance with them. So that was, but we remained friends ever since, despite our planning. And so again, for our listeners, we are the Arcus Group, www.arcusgrp.com. Garry, thanks for your time. Mike, I'll give you a little time to walk us out of here.
Absolutely. We've talked about before is that, we always talk about these big events. We talk about NATO or we talk about a convention, but, putting your perimeter or putting some type of a security plan in place doesn't have to be for a large event. You can do it for the smallest event that you can. And especially if you're in the private sector, you walk in with a formidable security plan for, in my case, movie premieres and things like that. It helps your local police agency. It helps your local law enforcement. It makes you look like you're a professional and know what you're doing. But, it puts them in a position to win as well if things go south, because you have hardened up your position and you don't have to make it look hard, but at least you've got a plan in place. And so, I would definitely encourage our listeners, if you have any issues, or whether it's a product rollout at a store or, some type of board of directors meeting you think you may have problems at, is to, give us a call at Arcus and we'll do what we can to try to mitigate your issues for you.
Well said, Mike. Garry had some amazing insights that it's kind of like I wish everyone had them, but great discussion. So it looks like our next episode, our next edition is we're going to actually get into the nitty gritty on fencing, what types there are, what's best used in particular circumstances. So that'll be fun. And again, thanks to Mike and our podcast team. And we look forward to chatting with everyone at our next episode.